Have you guys ever been in a situation where you just got introduced into a new video game series and you just played the newest entry in the series and you beat it, you loved it, it's one of your favorite games of all time, and it's looking like there won't be another new entry in the series for another 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years, but you really enjoyed that game and want to see more of what that series has to offer, so you look into older entries in the series, thinking that it'll be a similar experience to what you just had with the newest game. So then you end up buying the older game because you're so hyped thinking it's going to be the same exact thing as the game you just played, but it turns out it's not, because the game really hasn't aged well, and it actually plays nothing like the game that made you fall in love with the series in the first place. And that's exactly what happened to me recently when going from Skyrim to Morrowind. Now, I played Skyrim for years. Skyrim is one of my favorite games of all time. I never played Morrowind or Oblivion because I kind of knew that those games were older and it wouldn't be the same experience, but I'm like, fuck it. I mean, it's going to be 10 years before we get another Elder Scrolls, before we get Elder Scrolls 6, so I might as well try the older games and see if I like it. I mean, I knew Arita and Daggerfall I wasn't going to like because they were just way too old, but I think maybe I could have gotten into Morrowind, but it turns out I just can't. No matter how much I try, I can't like this game. I can't finish this game. I am so frustrated playing Morrowind that I just can't play it. No matter how much I love the Elder Scrolls lore and how much I love Skyrim, I can't get through Morrowind, and I probably can't go through Oblivion either. I tried Oblivion, I actually bought that game a while ago, but I ended up giving it away to somebody because I just didn't want to go through it. It was too old. But with Morrowind, it was even worse. Even with all the mods I tried to install to make it a little bit more palatable to my gaming tastes, nothing worked for me. It was just too damn old for me to enjoy. I was able to install a graphics patch to make it look really nice, and I was able to do as much as I could to make the game feel more modern, but it just didn't work for me. The gameplay felt too old, the combat was way too old, and Skyrim doesn't have amazing combat, don't get me wrong, but I think it's a lot better than Morrowind in my opinion. But that's probably because I started off with Skyrim and tried to play Morrowind after. If Morrowind was my first Elder Scrolls, I'd probably think of it different. I think that's the whole thing. It's all about perspective and what you were exposed to first. So if you played Morrowind before all the other Elder Scrolls games, then you would think that Morrowind's the greatest Elder Scrolls game of all time, probably. Now, my first Fallout was Fallout 4, and I kind of feel the same way about Fallout 4 that a lot of people feel about New Vegas or Fallout 3. I love that game, but a lot of people who were exposed to Fallout, who played Fallout a lot longer than I have, a lot of the older Fallout fans, they think Fallout 4 sucks and is actually a really bad RPG and is a bad entry in the Fallout series, but I completely disagree. I think Fallout 4 is one of my favorite games of all time, but it was also my first Fallout. Then when I went back to Fallout New Vegas and Fallout 3 after playing Fallout 4, you know, the funny thing is I still enjoyed Fallout 3 and Fallout New Vegas, even though I found Fallout 4's gameplay a lot better, because Fallout 3 and Fallout New Vegas had pretty shitty gunplay in my opinion. Not saying Fallout 4 is great, but it's a lot better than those games. But Fallout New Vegas had a fantastic story, the best story out of any Fallout game I played, and Fallout 3 also had a really kick-ass story, so I think the lore and the story is what kept me invested, even though the gameplay was not nearly as good as Fallout 4's. But what I find so weird is that that didn't translate into the Elder Scrolls series. I started off with Skyrim, I could not get into Oblivion, could not get into Morrowind, but for some reason, going from Fallout 4 to Fallout 3 New Vegas was fine, but I couldn't go from Skyrim to Morrowind and Oblivion. It just doesn't make a lot of sense to me why that is the case. I guess Fallout 3 and New Vegas aged a lot better than Oblivion, and especially Morrowind, which is 18 years old at this point. So maybe it was something about Fallout 3 and New Vegas that aged a lot better than Oblivion, which was only a couple years apart from Fallout 3. Oblivion came out in 2006, Fallout 3 came out in 2008, but for some reason I have no problem going through Fallout 3, but cannot even find myself getting through, like, the first 5 quests in Oblivion. It's just so strange. But it has to be something about the mechanics of Fallout 3 aging a lot better than Oblivion, even though it's only a 2-year difference. It has to be something like that, because I love Fallout 4 just as much as I love Skyrim, and I love both of the series equally, but I find myself having a completely different experience going back to the older games in each franchise. It's just so strange. But I love Fallout 3, love New Vegas, but there's no way you can find me playing Fallout 1 and Fallout 2. I just hate the top-down isometric gameplay. I just don't find it fun. I hate it. So even though there's so much lore from Fallout 1 and Fallout 2, and it's a pretty decent RPG, I just can't find myself playing that game because I'm used to playing Fallout from a 3D perspective. So when I have this 2D isometric point of view, I just hate it. It was the same thing going from GTA 3, I think, was my first one, or was it Vice City? One of those. I was definitely not even old enough to play them, but I still found a way. And then they came out with Chinatown Wars, and I'm like, this sucks. this is not Grand Theft Auto, it's shit, because it's from a 2D isometric perspective. Like, I never played GTA 1 and GTA 2 because even though they were considered great games for their time, I'm so used to the 3D Grand Theft Auto experience, I can't go back to a 2D isometric gameplay. Like, no, I can't do it because I just don't find it fun. And it's not what I expect from the series. And I think that's what it is. It's the gameplay itself not aging very well, mixed in with my expectations being so high that I think that if I go back to an older GTA game, it's gonna be like the ones I played, even though it's not. Another example I can think of is how much I loved Red Dead Redemption 1 back in the day, but then I tried to go to Red Dead Revolver, which is completely different. If you ever played it, the gameplay is so different. It's not an open world game at all. It's very linear, and it's just completely different. If you try to play Red Dead Revolver, it's a completely different experience than Red Dead Redemption, and I didn't realize that, and I played Red Dead Revolver, I'm like, man, I'm really not enjoying this, because I expected it to be like Red Dead Redemption because it was part of the same Red Dead series, but it turned out not to be the case. And I think, that's the thing. My expectations are too high, expecting it to be just like the game I just played, even though the new game is a lot newer and it's more refined and they had more technology to use. But I guess that expectation is still there, hoping for it to be just like what you experienced, even though the game that you played is a lot newer. It's just kind of weird. Even though I kept telling myself in my head, Morrowind is not going to be the same as Skyrim, I kind of had that expectation coming in. I just still didn't find the gameplay enjoyable. I didn't like that there was no mini-map, I didn't like that there was no quest marker, even though that makes me sound like a casual. I just loved having that in Skyrim because it made the gameplay go a lot smoother, and I wasted so much less time because the quest marker told me where to go. And everything about the game is just so different from what I experienced in Skyrim, and it kind of turned me away from the game. Even though I knew it was going to be different, I just didn't like how different it was. So no matter how much I said in my head, it's not like Skyrim, it's something different, but I still couldn't find myself to enjoy it. And it's a real shame because I kind of feel like I'm doing myself a disservice because there's so much amazing story, lore, character development, amazing things about Morrowind and all these other older games that I refuse to play, that I will just never be able to experience because the gameplay is just so off-putting for me. But I guess that's not a bad problem, because if it weren't for Skyrim, I probably wouldn't have been an Elder Scrolls fan in the first place. Same thing with Fallout 4. So I think, gameplay is meant to evolve over time, and yeah, going back to the old stuff, it's gonna feel really old, and I think that's a good thing. It means that the series is developing and evolving over time. So ultimately, I think it's a good thing that I'm having this problem with all my favorite series, the new Assassin's Creed games. I mean, I can't go back to the old ones because they just feel so linear and so small in comparison. But Assassin's Creed Odyssey, Origins, and I'm sure the new Valhalla, it's just so much different, it's so much better, that I can never go back to the old Assassin's Creed. And even though that kind of sucks because there's so much story and so much amazing content in those old games, that I really do feel like I'm missing out on a lot, it's definitely a lot better than having the opposite problem where you can't play the newer games and you're stuck on the older ones. For me, Saints Row is a good example of that. I love Saints Row 1 and 2, but 3 and 4 are just fucking terrible games in my opinion. But the thing is, people who didn't play 1 and 2 and played 3 and 4 first, they're gonna have a different opinion, and that's all it is. It's about where you grow up with the series. Even though I grew up with Assassin's Creed, I just couldn't get into it, and then the new Assassin's Creed came out and I loved it. But man, talk about the Mass Effect series. This is a good example of the opposite problem, where I loved the entire Mass Effect trilogy. Even 3, it was a little bit polarizing, but I still thought it was good. But I fucking hate Andromeda because it's just so bad, the story is not as good. Everything about the game, except for the gameplay. I think the gameplay is a vast improvement from Mass Effect, but that's the other thing. Even though the gameplay is better, if the character development, the story is not there, then it's a piece of shit. And that's exactly how I feel about Andromeda. It was a rushed game, it was a shitty game, and EA really fucked up the Mass Effect series with that entry. So I guess it's a good thing to have the opposite problem where you love the newer game but can't get into the older games, rather than the newer games being so fucking terrible that you have to play the old ones, you know what I mean? But definitely let me know in the comments if you ever had a similar experience where you just fell in love with a new game in the series and you try to play the older ones and you just can't because the new one is so amazing that you expect the old ones to be just as amazing, but they're not. And you kind of feel a little disappointed even though your expectations were probably a little bit too high. So definitely share your stories in the comments down below. I'll be sure to read them in my monthly recap in a few days. But that pretty much wraps up today's video. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your weekend.